Thanks. I followed the work of Maria and Jose for quite a while on trade credit and banking, so I was thrilled to get this opportunity, and I actually knew very little about the public credit registries, other than they didn't seem to have an effect. So I thought, what a great opportunity to teach me a little bit about finance. Credit registries are about public disclosure. And public disclosure is awesome because it makes markets efficient. It expands the pie. Problem is it doesn't expand the pie for everyone. There are going to be winners and there are going to be losers. There's some credit risks out there, Jim, who are really good credit risks, but if you look on paper, he doesn't look so good. He's a hidden gem. And so when this information is revealed, he gets a better rate. There are potential entrant bankers that are going to come in and be able to steal Jim. This is kind of Abner, so he's a winner. The losers are the established banks who have been essentially overcharging Jim, and so that's going to create the incentive. I'd rather not disclose my information. That means there's an informational monopoly. That's kind of the words Maria used. And that was the genesis of my original paper with Raghu on lending relationships. We wanted to show that relationships mattered, so we predicted that as relationships expanded, the rate at which I'd lend to you fell. We didn't find that to be true. We did, interestingly, find that the quantity increased. Because as I lent to Jim over time, I found he was a better credit risk, my cost declined. Since Abner didn't know that, I didn't have to pass those along, so my margin increased, and as a result, I lent him more. And that's where we come into this incentive. When you require me to disclose this information to Abner, I'm going to choose potentially to manipulate or to lie. And that's going to be the thesis of the paper. There's going to be two pieces. One, the ratings I report are going to change, and they're going to change by deviating from truth opposed to converging from truth. The first part's relatively clear. The second part is the interpretation we have to figure out. That means there's going to be two parts of the paper. One is the quality dimension that Maria talked about. We're going to rate firms from 1 to 5. Interestingly, 3 through 5 are completely mechanical, and in some placebo tests she didn't report, downgrades before versus after the treatment to 3 to 5 have no effect. So it looks like it's only in that discretionary of where they draw the line between 1 and 2. And we're going to look at downgrades from 1 to 2 and upgrades from 2 to 1. For this to make sense, I've got to have an issue about competition. Because if it's perfectly competitive, all of this effect goes away. And she's going to look in 2 dimensions. One, how many lenders? These firms are small, so a large fraction have a single lender. If you've got multiple lenders and multiple people know how well you are, arguably that's a very competitive market. If you've only got a single lender, you could, in theory, have other lenders competing, but you choose one, but that's going to create the opportunity for you to be captured. The second way she's going to do it is by looking at the type of the bank. And here she's arguing the soft versus hard information. Abner can see public information. How big is Jim? What is his industry? How long has he been around? But I've been able to interact with him for the last 10 years, and that soft information, you need people on the ground. Foreign banks, in theory, could have people on the ground, but may choose not to. Domestic banks clearly have people on the ground, but they're big. And so when she says domestic, there's actually two versions. Large Argentinian banks and local ones. I think of those as community banks. And it's when you break them into those three that you find the results are the most interesting. Okay, she's going to make a distinction between high quality and low quality. And so I want to put together a numerical example. Imagine there are two borrowers, and for simplicity, the required expected return is 10% for both, and the recovery and default is 50%. One borrower has a default rate of 1%. So if you figure out the right rate, I should charge him 10.6. The other has a default rate of 5%. So the right borrowing rate is 13. However, the outsider can't see. On paper, they look like they both have a 5% default rate, so I charge them 13.2. That's where you're going to get that monopoly in the sense I'm going to overcharge the first one. Originally, I give them a rating of 1 or 2 when it's internal, but when I go public, I don't want you to know that good rating is actually a good credit risk, so that's the one I'm going to map. High quality ones are going to be captured. The paper is going to flip when it gets to the low quality. Lenders to low quality borrowers do not enjoy informational rents. Why do you ask? Because they're riskier, and riskier borrowers require higher rates of return. That's factually true, the second piece, but the first piece doesn't follow. See, that rate you charge someone's a function of the cost, which is based on risk, and the markup, which is based on competition. And if you increase that risk bottom, you could or could not have a margin. Take two other borrowers. One has a 10% default rate, one has a 15. If the external market thinks both are 15, my slide is wrong, I can capture that other one. So that informational monopoly is going to work no matter what the credit quality is, and so the different results she gets has to come from some other effect, and the run she talks about it could be part of it. Now we get to the empirical works, and she's going to do a diff and diff. There's going to be 3 time periods: pre, interim where I have to report, but it's not publicly disclosed yet, I know it is, and post where it is. And so she's going to look at that treatment versus interim period, and that coefficient for the downgrades is 3.6%. Those of you who know me, I'm not very fancy on econometrics, so I actually like to see the 2x2 table. This isn't in the paper, but I construct it from the regression results and the table. If you look at the controls, the fraction that are the 2% grade 2 rises by a little bit, 7.4. The treatment goes up a lot, 3.7, and that's where she gets her coefficient of 3.6. Now, when you see that increase, it can come from the control is dropping and treatment's flat. The beauty of the control being flat means there's not other things going on in the economy, which in theory those time dummies take out. In practice, they don't always if you have different sensitivities. So this makes me feel more comfortable. Once you know the control's flat and the treatment has a steeper slope, there's 2 possibilities. The treatment is converging to the controls, or the treatment is diverging from the controls. And when you talk about this truth versus manipulation, you got to think about what is the incentive of the controls, and should I see this change or reform cause a convergence or a divergence? Her figure 2 is beautiful. Not only can you see my table, but you see for the single lenders that increase is a convergence. I'm starting to look like the controls. And the multi-lenders goes the opposite direction. It looks like converging to the controls. So the story you want to tell, if you want to tell manipulation, is the truth is converging to the falsehood, but everybody else was doing that before. Okay, how do I understand this? There's only 2 rankings, 1 and 2, that we're going to look at, but there's a range of credit quality. So really that ranking is where you draw the line. And imagine that once I go public, I'm going to change the line. So those marginal 1s, I'm now going to convert to 2 because those are the really good credit quality risks that I kind of want to hide. I don't want Abner to steal. Good news is the probability default conditional on being a 2 now goes up because I put some higher quality guys in the 2 bucket. The problem is I took the worst quality ones and I put them in the 2 bucket, and that means the probability default also declines for the 1s. The empirical evidence in Table 8 says it goes the other way. So that means that my story's not quite right. It also means this isn't a story about precision, this is a story about means. Where you draw the line doesn't necessarily make it more or less precise, it's just a question of how you classify it. So I need to have a different way to draw the picture. Okay, let's take those marginal 1s and I'm going to reclassify them as 2, the stories before. But take the marginal 2s and reclassify them as 1. The good news is now I get the results of the paper. The probability default if you're a 2 declines, the probability of a 1 increases. There are a couple of issues with that. One, when you go back to the diff and diff, that 3.6 doesn't happen in the foreign. That was her point. It also doesn't happen in the big domestics. So the results you're going to see are happening only in those local banks. So when you start to tell the story, it's all about that group. Well, if I add noise, that would explain it. I've got 2 issues going on. One, those changes in downgrades and changes in upgrades are temporary. So if you look at the regression coefficients, those upgrades of R1 goes up 18.6% to the interim period, but then it drops back to 11. And the pre versus post is no longer statistically significant. The downgrades drop 3.6, but then they bounce back up about 2.6. Pre versus post is no longer statistically significant. If you want to look at behavioral responses from the competitive banks, they don't see the interim numbers, they only see the post numbers. So you're seeing very dramatic results in what the bank is doing, but then it flips back almost to where it was before. There's no change in leverage. The only thing you see is in those foreign banks. This is the picture that I keep coming back to. You see there is a convergence, and I told you the convergence happens only with the local banks. So that means the big foreign banks and the big domestic banks are not changing pre or interim or control. Maybe they were always reporting ratings that had absolutely no meanings. If very few of those were below this 200 cutoff, why have a fudge factor for those? If the local banks were using truthful, because most of them were below, and now they're having a fudge factor. This is where I'm having trouble putting the story together. It's clear you see ratings changes. It's clear that they're relatively temporary, and the question is, what is the story? We know it only happens in the local banks. So you need to tell a story. Maybe the local banks are clueless and they start to figure this out, or maybe they're truthfully reporting and they decide to change, but then you got to explain why they change back. The marginal credit risks seem to be the ones that are flipping. Now, I can't quite get that out from the regressions. That's why I did my numerical example to figure out what reconciles with the regressions, because it has to be the marginal ones, I think, that flip. The ratings are becoming more similar, not less similar. And so you need to tell a story about what's happening with the controls, as well as what's happening with the treatments of the foreign and the large domestic. I think this is an incredibly interesting experiment. I think it's an incredibly important question. I just haven't quite, in my mind, pieced all the pieces together into an internally consistent story.